The snow fell silently over the small Dutch town of Roermond on the morning of March 2nd, 1945. The war was ending. Everyone could sense it. The Allied forces were advancing from the west, the sound of artillery growing closer each day. But in the basement of the town's municipal courthouse, a different kind of thunder was about to break. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a 32-year-old officer of the Wehrmacht, stood before a makeshift military tribunal. His face was pale, his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the wooden table. He was not there as a judge. He was there as the accused. The charge was desertion. The evidence was a single unsigned letter found in his barracks, a letter that spoke of his doubts about the war, about the orders he had been given to execute civilians in a nearby village. The tribunal lasted less than 2 hours. By noon, Lieutenant Weber was tied to a post in the courtyard. By 12:15, he was dead, his body slumped forward against the ropes, blood staining the snow beneath his boots. 6 years later, in 1951, the military court that had ordered his execution was itself put on trial. The presiding judge of that original tribunal, Colonel Friedrich Brenner, sat in the defendant's chair in The Hague. The prosecutors presented mountains of evidence. They showed that Weber had never deserted. They proved that the letter was likely planted, that the execution was carried out to silence an officer who had witnessed war crimes and was preparing to report them. They demonstrated that Colonel Brenner had acted with full knowledge of Weber's innocence, that he had deliberately manipulated the proceedings to ensure a death sentence. The evidence was overwhelming, incontrovertible. And yet, after 3 months of testimony, Colonel Brenner walked free. The judges ruled that he had acted within the legal framework of German military law as it existed in March of 1945. They acknowledged the injustice. They even expressed sympathy for Lieutenant Weber's family. But the law, they said, was clear. Brenner had followed procedure. The execution, though tragic, was legal. How is such a verdict possible? How can a deliberate murder, disguised as military justice, be declared lawful by an international court dedicated to prosecuting war crimes? This is the question that haunted a young Dutch lawyer named Pieter Van Doren when he read the verdict in the newspaper on a gray morning in November 1951. Van Doren was not supposed to care about this case. He was 29 years old, recently married, building a quiet practice in contract law in Amsterdam. He had survived the war by keeping his head down, by avoiding politics, by focusing on the small, manageable details of property disputes and commercial agreements. But Lieutenant Hans Weber had been his cousin. They had grown up together in Roermond, played in the same streets, attended the same schools. Hans had been like an older brother to him, the one who taught him to ride a bicycle, the one who encouraged him to study law when their family had little money for university. When Hans joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, Peter had felt betrayed. They had barely spoken in the years that followed. Peter heard about the execution through a distant relative in 1946, a full year after Hans died. He grieved alone, telling almost no one, ashamed of his cousin's uniform, ashamed of his own silence during the war. But now, reading the verdict, Peter felt something different. Not shame, but rage. The court had admitted that Hans was innocent. They had acknowledged that Brenner knew this. And yet, Brenner was free, living comfortably in Bavaria, his pension intact, his reputation barely tarnished. The legal system had looked at a murder and called it paperwork. Peter's wife found him that evening sitting in his study, the newspaper still in his hands, his coffee long since gone cold. She asked him what was wrong. He told her he needed to understand how this happened. She reminded him that they were building a life, that they were trying to start a family, that digging into the past would bring nothing but pain. He nodded, agreed, promised her he would let it go, but he didn't. That night, after she fell asleep, he went back to his study and began to write letters. Letters to the prosecutors in The Hague, to archives in Germany and Belgium, to libraries and universities and military historians. He asked them all the same question. Was there any precedent, any legal principle, Any document that could overturn the ruling on Colonel Brenner? For 6 months, Peter received nothing but polite refusals. The prosecutors in The Hague wrote back, saying the case was closed, the verdict final. German archivists informed him that most military records from the final months of the war had been destroyed or lost. Belgian lawyers told him that pursuing Brenner now would be pointless. Even if new evidence emerged, the statute of limitations had likely expired under German law. His colleagues in Amsterdam began to notice his distraction. Clients complained that he seemed distant, that he missed deadlines. His wife grew worried, then frustrated, then quietly resigned. She stopped asking about his research, stopped trying to pull him back to the present. They spoke less and less, their dinners punctuated by long silences and the sound of cutlery on plates. But Peter couldn't stop. It wasn't about Hans anymore, not entirely. It was about the logic of the verdict itself, the way the judges had shrugged at the evidence and pointed to procedure. It was about the idea that someone could commit a murder and walk free simply because they had filled out the right forms, followed the right steps, even if those steps were themselves designed to produce an unjust outcome. He began to study the legal codes that had governed the Wehrmacht in 1945. He spent his weekends in the library of the University of Amsterdam, pulling dusty volumes of German military law from the shelves, translating them slowly, page by page. His German was functional but imperfect, and he often had to consult dictionaries and grammar guides to parse the dense, bureaucratic language. The work was tedious, mind-numbing, but he persisted. 3 months into this research, Peter encountered his first real obstacle. He had been examining the German Military Penal Code of 1943, which had replaced an earlier code from 1940. He found the section on desertion, the legal basis for Brenner's tribunal. The code defined desertion as the willful abandonment of duty during wartime, and it prescribed the death penalty as the standard punishment for officers. The language was clear, unambiguous, but as Peter read further, he found something odd. The code included a provision, Article 78, that required the presiding officer of any court-martial to verify the evidence of desertion through a minimum of 2 independent witnesses before proceeding to sentencing. In Hans Weber's case, there had been no witnesses. The only evidence was the unsigned letter. Peter felt a surge of excitement. This was it. Brenner had violated the code. The execution was illegal, even by the standards of Nazi military law. He wrote immediately to the prosecutors in The Hague, attaching copies of the relevant articles, explaining his findings. He sent the letter by express mail, certain that this would reopen the case. 2 weeks later, he received a response. The prosecutors thanked him for his diligence. They acknowledged that Article 78 existed, but they pointed out that the Military Penal Code had been amended in January of 1945, just 2 months before Weber's execution. The amendment, issued as an emergency decree by the High Command, had suspended the witness requirement for cases involving desertion in frontline zones. Brenner's tribunal had taken place in Rwanda, which was classified as a frontline zone due to the proximity of Allied forces. Therefore, Brenner had not violated the law. The execution, though unjust, remained technically legal. Peter sat in his study. The letter from The Hague spread out before him and felt the walls closing in. He had been so certain. The amendment was a detail he had missed, a loophole that swallowed his argument whole. He wanted to tear up the letter, to throw the books across the room, to scream at the absurdity of it all. Instead, he sat very still, staring at the words, until the light outside faded and the room grew dark around him. His wife found him there hours later, asleep at his desk, his head resting on his arms. She touched his shoulder gently, and he woke with a start. She asked him if he was giving up. He looked at her, exhausted, and said he didn't know. She told him that she loved him, that she would support whatever he decided, but that she couldn't watch him destroy himself over something that might be impossible. He nodded, too tired to argue. But the next morning, something shifted. Peter went back to the library, back to the volumes of military law. He read the January 1945 amendment again, more carefully this time. He noticed something he had overlooked before. The amendment suspended the witness requirement, yes, but it included a clause, buried in the middle of a long paragraph, that required all death sentences issued under the amended code to be reviewed by a senior legal officer within 48 hours of the verdict. The review was meant to ensure that even in the chaos of the front line, executions were not carried out on the basis of error or fraud. Peter's heart began to race. He needed to find out if Brenner's sentence had been reviewed. If it hadn't, then the execution was illegal, even under the amended code. If it had, then he needed to see the review, to know what the senior legal officer had said. He wrote again to The Hague, asking for copies of all documents related to the review process for Weber's case. This time, the prosecutors were less patient. They replied tersely, stating that no such review documents existed in their files. They suggested that if Peter wanted to pursue this further, he should contact the German Federal Archives directly. And so, Peter did. He wrote to the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, requesting access to any records related to military tribunals in the Rwanda district in March of 1945. The response took 3 months. When it finally arrived, it was brief and discouraging. The archives confirmed that most Wehrmacht records from the final months of the war had been destroyed, either deliberately by retreating German forces or accidentally in the chaos of the Allied advance. They had a small collection of documents from the Rwanda area, but nothing related to courts-martial or executions. They wished him luck in his research. Peter felt the ground giving way beneath him. Without the review documents, he had nothing. The case was dead. Brenner would live out his days in peace, and Hans would remain just another casualty of a legal system that prized procedure over justice. He sat in his study that evening, surrounded by books and letters and notes, and considered giving up. His wife was right. This was destroying him. He was neglecting his practice, his marriage, his life. He was chasing a ghost, trying to resurrect a case that the world had already forgotten. But then, almost as an afterthought, he remembered something. During his initial research, he had come across a reference to a private collector in Belgium, a retired military historian named Edouard Lemaire, who had spent decades gathering documents related to the German occupation. The reference had been in a footnote in an obscure academic journal, and Peter had dismissed it at the time, assuming that a private collector would have nothing of relevance. But now, with no other options, he decided it was worth a try. He wrote to Lemaire, explaining his research, asking if by any chance the collection included anything related to Wehrmacht tribunals in the Netherlands. He sent the letter on a Friday and tried not to think about it over the weekend. On Monday, he returned to his office to find a telegram waiting for him. It was from Lemaire. It said simply, "Come to Brussels. I may have what you need." Peter took the train the next morning. The journey from Amsterdam to Brussels was just over 2 hours, but it felt like days. He sat by the window watching the flat Dutch countryside give way to the rolling hills of Flanders, trying to manage his expectations. Lemaire probably had nothing. This would be another dead end, another disappointment. But there was a small, stubborn part of him that refused to stop hoping. Lemaire's home was a narrow townhouse in the Excel district, its facade painted a faded yellow, ivy creeping up the walls. Peter knocked on the door, and it was opened by a small, elderly man with white hair and thick glasses. Lemaire smiled warmly and invited him in. The interior of the house was overwhelming. Every surface was covered with documents, books, maps, photographs. There were boxes stacked in the hallways, filing cabinets lining the walls, loose papers piled on chairs. It looked less like a home and more like a chaotic archive, a physical manifestation of decades of obsessive collecting. Lemaire led Peter to a small sitting room on the second floor, where he had cleared a space on a low table. He offered tea, which Peter accepted gratefully, and then sat down across from him. Lemaire explained that he had been collecting documents related to the occupation since the end of the war. His own father had been executed by the Germans in 1944, accused of sabotage, and Lemaire had spent his life trying to understand the legal and bureaucratic machinery that had made such executions possible. He had purchased documents from former soldiers, rescued papers from attics and basements, corresponded with archives across Europe. His collection was vast, disorganized, but comprehensive. When Peter explained what he was looking for, Lemaire's eyes lit up. He stood abruptly and disappeared into the next room. Peter heard the sound of boxes being moved, drawers being opened and closed, the rustle of paper. After several minutes, Lemaire returned carrying a thin manila folder, slightly yellowed with age. He set it on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were 6 typewritten pages, held together with a rusted paperclip. The top page was a cover sheet, stamped with the seal of the Wehrmacht High Command. The second page was a report, dated March 4th, 1945, signed by a Major Dieter Kessler, legal officer, 12th Army Division. The report was titled, Review of Sentence, Case Number 237, Lieutenant Hans Weber. Peter's hands trembled as he picked up the document. He read it slowly, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The report confirmed that Major Kessler had reviewed Brenner's sentence within the required 48-hour window. But more than that, the report explicitly stated that Kessler had found significant irregularities in the proceedings. The unsigned letter, Kessler wrote, did not constitute sufficient evidence of desertion. The lack of witnesses was troubling. The speed of the trial suggested procedural haste, inconsistent with the gravity of a capital sentence. Kessler's recommendation was clear. The sentence should be commuted to imprisonment, pending further investigation. But the report included one more page, a response from Brenner, dated the same day, March 4th. In it, Brenner acknowledged Kessler's concerns, but argued that the exigencies of war required swift justice. He invoked his authority as commanding officer of the district and stated that the execution would proceed as scheduled. The final page was a brief note from Kessler, dated March 5th, stating that the execution had been carried out despite his recommendation and that he was formally registering his objection to the proceedings. Peter looked up at Lemaire, unable to speak. Lemaire nodded slowly. He explained that he had acquired the document 5 years earlier from the widow of a German officer who had served in the same division as Kessler. The widow had found it among her husband's papers after he died and had wanted to get rid of anything connected to the war. Lemaire had purchased the entire collection for a small sum, but he hadn't looked through most of it. When he received Peter's letter, he had spent 2 days searching through boxes until he found this folder. Peter asked if he could make a copy. Lemaire agreed immediately. They went together to a nearby print shop, where Peter carefully photographed each page. He paid for the film to be developed urgently, and by the end of the day, he had a complete set of copies. He thanked Lemaire profusely, promised to stay in touch, and took the evening train back to Amsterdam. On the train, Peter read through the copies again and again, making notes in the margins, underlining key phrases. The implications were staggering. Brenner had not only violated the amended code by ignoring Kessler's review, but he had done so knowingly, explicitly rejecting the legal officer's recommendation. This was not a procedural error. This was a deliberate act of defiance against the very legal framework he later claimed to have followed. The execution was illegal even by the standards of Nazi military law, even in the chaos of a frontline zone, even under the emergency amendments. Brenner had murdered Hans Weber, and the evidence was now sitting in Peter's briefcase. When he arrived home, his wife was waiting for him. She saw the look on his face and asked what had happened. He showed her the documents, explained what they meant. She read them carefully, and when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. She asked him what he was going to do. He said he was going to reopen the case. But it wasn't that simple. The next morning, Peter contacted the prosecutors in The Hague again, explaining that he had new evidence. They were skeptical. They asked for copies, which he sent immediately. 2 weeks later, they invited him to their office for a meeting. The meeting did not go as Peter had hoped. The prosecutors acknowledged that the document was significant. They agreed that it demonstrated Brenner's willful violation of military law. but they raised several concerns. First, the document came from a private collection, not an official archive. Its authenticity would need to be verified, which could take months. Second, even if the document was authentic, reopening a case that had been closed for 2 years would require approval from multiple levels of the Dutch and German governments, a process that was politically delicate and bureaucratically nightmarish. Third, and most troubling, the lead prosecutor pointed out that the statute of limitations for war crimes under German law was 15 years from the date of the offense. Weber's execution had taken place in March of 1945. It was now November of 1952. They had less than 8 years to bring Brenner to trial, and the clock was ticking. Peter left the meeting feeling both elated and crushed. He had the evidence, but the system was determined to ignore it. He spent the next 3 weeks writing letters, making phone calls, trying to find anyone who would take the case seriously. Most ignored him. Some were openly hostile, suggesting that he was wasting everyone's time with ancient grievances. Then, in January of 1953, Peter received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from Major Pieter Kessler himself. Kessler, now a civilian working as a legal consultant in Munich, had heard about Peter's efforts through a colleague. He wrote that he had been haunted by the Weber case for years, that he had tried multiple times to bring charges against Brenner after the war, but had been rebuffed by German authorities who were eager to move past the occupation. He offered to testify, to provide any assistance Peter needed. He also mentioned that he still had his personal notes from the review, including a copy of the original unsigned letter that had been used as evidence against Weber. The letter, Kessler wrote, had been typed on a machine that belonged to Brenner's office, not to Weber. The forensic analysis had never been entered into the record of the original tribunal. This was the breakthrough Peter needed. With Kessler's testimony and the forensic evidence, he could prove not only that Brenner had violated the law, but that he had done so as part of a deliberate conspiracy to murder an officer who threatened to expose his war crimes. He contacted the prosecutors again, this time with Kessler's letter. They agreed to meet. The second meeting was longer and more substantive. The prosecutors were impressed by Kessler's willingness to testify. They acknowledged that the forensic evidence about the typewriter was potentially explosive, but they remained cautious. Verifying Kessler's claims would require tracking down the original typewriter, or at least documentation of its assignment to Brenner's office. This would mean accessing Wehrmacht supply records, which might not even exist anymore. And even if they could verify everything, the political climate in Germany was shifting. The new government was focused on rebuilding, on integrating former soldiers back into civilian life. There was little appetite for reopening old war crimes cases, especially those involving officers who had technically followed procedure. But Peter refused to give up. He traveled to Munich to meet Kessler in person. The two men spent 3 days together, going through Kessler's notes, reconstructing the timeline of events, preparing a detailed legal memorandum. Kessler was meticulous, methodical. He had kept everything: copies of orders, correspondence with Brenner, his own handwritten observations from the tribunal. Together, they built a case that was airtight, irrefutable. In March of 1953, Peter submitted a formal petition to the International Military Tribunal to reopen the case against Colonel Friedrich Brenner. The petition was 200 pages long, supported by dozens of exhibits. It argued that Brenner had committed murder under German military law, that he had falsified evidence, and that he had deliberately obstructed the legal review process designed to prevent such abuses. It requested that the original verdict be overturned and that Brenner be charged with war crimes. For 4 months, there was silence. Peter heard nothing from The Hague. He continued his work in Amsterdam, but his mind was always elsewhere, waiting for word. His colleagues noticed that he seemed more focused now, less distracted. His wife saw that he was sleeping better, that some of the weight had lifted from his shoulders. He had done everything he could. The outcome was no longer in his hands. Then, in July of 1953, Peter received a telegram from The Hague. The tribunal had agreed to review the petition. A hearing was scheduled for September. The hearing lasted 6 days. Peter sat in the gallery, watching as the prosecutors presented the evidence he had gathered. Kessler testified for an entire afternoon, describing the review process, explaining the irregularities he had found, recounting his confrontation with Brenner. The forensic expert testified about the typewriter, confirming that the unsigned letter had been typed on a machine assigned to Brenner's office. Documents were entered into evidence. Timelines were reconstructed. Legal arguments were parsed and debated. Brenner's defense. Attorney tried to argue that the new evidence was inadmissible, that it came from unreliable sources, that the statute of limitations should apply. But the prosecutors were prepared for every objection. They demonstrated that the documents were authentic, that Kessler's testimony was credible, that the statute of limitations did not apply because the original trial had been based on fraudulent evidence. On the 6th day, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The judges ruled that the evidence presented by Peter and Kessler was compelling and credible. They found that Colonel Friedrich Brenner had willfully violated German military law in the execution of Lieutenant Hans Weber. They overturned the original verdict and ordered that Brenner be immediately arrested and charged with murder and obstruction of justice. Peter sat in the gallery, tears streaming down his face, as the judges read their decision. Hans Weber, they said, was innocent. He had been murdered by a commanding officer who sought to silence him. The execution was illegal, criminal, and unjust. Brenner's conviction today would serve as a precedent, a reminder that no one, not even those acting under the cover of law, was above accountability. Brenner was arrested the next day at his home in Bavaria. He was extradited to the Netherlands and tried in a Dutch court for murder. The trial lasted 8 months. In May of 1954, Brenner was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison 6 years later. But the story did not end with Brenner's conviction. The legal principles established by Peter's case reverberated through the international legal community. The tribunal's ruling became a cornerstone of the emerging doctrine of individual criminal responsibility under international law. It established that following orders or adhering to domestic legal procedures was not a defense if those procedures were themselves designed to produce an unjust outcome. The ruling was cited in subsequent war crimes trials, including the Eichmann trial in 1961 and the trials of Yugoslav and Rwandan leaders in the 1990s. In 1955, the United Nations commissioned a study on the accountability of military officers during wartime. The study referenced Peter's case extensively, using it as an example of how legal systems could be manipulated to commit crimes under the guise of legality. The study's recommendations formed the basis for the Geneva Convention's additional protocols of 1977, which codified the principle that military officers have a duty to refuse illegal orders, even if those orders are issued through proper channels. Pieter Van Doren never returned to contract law. He spent the rest of his career as a legal advocate for victims of war crimes, working with international tribunals and human rights organizations. He testified before the International Court of Justice on multiple occasions, always emphasizing the importance of looking beyond procedure to the substance of justice. He argued that the law was not a shield for those who would abuse it, but a tool for those who sought to uphold it. He died in 1987, at the age of 65, surrounded by his family. His obituary in the International Herald Tribune described him as a quiet hero, a man who had refused to accept injustice simply because it came dressed in the language of legality. His wife, who survived him by 15 years, often told the story of the night he came home from Brussels with the manila folder, his hands shaking, his eyes bright with purpose. She said that in that moment, she knew he had found what he was looking for, not just evidence, but a reason to believe that the law could still serve justice, even when justice seemed impossible. Today, the Weber case is taught in law schools around the world as a foundational example of how legal systems can be subverted and how individuals can fight back. The documents Peter discovered are housed in the archives of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, available to researchers and students. Major Kessler's testimony is often cited as a model of moral courage, a reminder that those who work within the system have a duty to speak out when the system fails. And Lieutenant Hans Weber, who died in the snow in Roermond on a cold March morning, is remembered not as a deserter, but as a victim, a man who tried to do the right thing in the midst of a war that made doing the right thing almost impossible. His name is inscribed on a memorial in his hometown, alongside the names of other victims of Nazi military justice. The inscription reads simply, "He died seeking truth. His cousin ensured that truth was found." The legacy of Pieter Van Doren's work extends far beyond the Weber case. His investigation established a template for how individuals can challenge systemic injustice, even when the system appears impenetrable. He showed that the law, for all its flaws, contains within it the seeds of its own correction. The key is finding those seeds, nurturing them, and refusing to let them be buried by bureaucracy and indifference. In the decades since Brenner's conviction, lawyers and activists around the world have followed Peter's example. They have dug through archives, interviewed witnesses, challenged verdicts, and fought to reopen cases that seemed closed forever. Some have succeeded, others have failed, but all have been guided by the principle that Peter demonstrated so powerfully, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that the truth, once uncovered, has a power that no amount of legal maneuvering can suppress. The Weber case also had a profound impact on the development of international humanitarian law. Before Peter's investigation, the concept of individual criminal responsibility for violations of military law was poorly defined. Commanders could often escape accountability by claiming they were following orders or adhering to the legal procedures of their own military systems. The tribunal's ruling in the Weber case made it clear that this was no longer acceptable. Military officers, the tribunal held, have a personal responsibility to ensure that their actions comply not just with the letter of the law, but with fundamental principles of justice and human rights. This principle was enshrined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted in 1998. Article 27 of the statute explicitly states that official capacity does not exempt individuals from criminal responsibility, and Article 33 limits the defense of superior orders to situations where the order was not manifestly unlawful. These provisions draw directly from the legal reasoning established in the Weber case. The case also influenced the development of whistleblower protections in military contexts. Hans Weber's attempt to report war crimes and his subsequent murder for doing so highlighted the dangers faced by those who try to expose wrongdoing from within the military. In response, many countries have since adopted laws and regulations designed to protect service members who report illegal activities. These protections are far from perfect, but they represent an acknowledgement that the military, like any institution, needs mechanisms for internal accountability. Pieter Van Doren's personal journey also offers important lessons about perseverance and the cost of seeking justice. His investigation nearly destroyed his marriage, damaged his career, and consumed years of his life. There were moments when giving up would have been the rational choice, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable and the chances of success negligible. But he persisted, driven by a conviction that the truth mattered, that his cousin's memory deserved vindication, and that the legal system, despite its flaws, could be made to serve justice. This aspect of Peter's story resonates with many who work in the field of human rights and transitional justice. The pursuit of accountability for past crimes is often a lonely, frustrating, and thankless endeavor. The perpetrators are often powerful, well-connected, and protected by statute of limitations or political considerations. The evidence is scattered, incomplete, or deliberately destroyed. The public may be indifferent or actively hostile, preferring to move on rather than confront difficult truths. But Peter's example shows that persistence can overcome these obstacles, that a single dedicated individual, armed with patience and determination, can sometimes achieve what seems impossible. The role of Edouard Lemaire, the Belgian collector, also deserves recognition. His decision to preserve documents that others considered worthless, his willingness to spend decades gathering materials that might never be used, proved crucial to Peter's success. In many ways, Lemaire represents the unsung heroes of historical justice. The archivists, librarians, collectors, and researchers who maintain the documentary record of the past, often with little recognition or support. Without Lemaire's obsessive collecting, the evidence against Brenner would never have been found, and the case would have remained closed. This highlights an important truth about historical justice. It depends not just on legal advocacy, but on the preservation of memory. Documents must be saved, testimonies must be recorded, stories must be told and retold. The past is not static. It is constantly being reconstructed through the materials that survive and the efforts of those who care enough to seek them out. Peter's success was made possible by Lemaire's foresight, and both men played essential roles in ensuring that Hans Weber's story was not forgotten. The impact of the Weber case on German society was also significant. In the immediate post-war years, Germany was deeply divided about how to address its Nazi past. Some advocated for a complete reckoning, a thorough examination of every crime committed during the war. Others argued for pragmatism, for moving forward without dwelling on the past. The prosecution of Brenner forced Germans to confront an uncomfortable truth, that war crimes had not been committed only by high-ranking Nazi officials, but also by ordinary officers acting within the military legal system. Brenner was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat, a man who had used the machinery of law to commit murder. This realization contributed to a broader shift in German public consciousness. It became harder to claim ignorance, harder to argue that ordinary Germans had no choice but to follow orders. The Weber case showed that even within the Wehrmacht, there had been opportunities to resist, to question, to refuse illegal orders. Major Kessler's testimony demonstrated that some officers had tried to uphold legal standards, even in the chaos of the war's final months. Their example made it more difficult for other former officers to claim that resistance had been impossible. In the years following Brenner's conviction, Germany gradually developed a more rigorous approach to confronting its Nazi past. The Ulm Einsatzgruppen trial in 1958, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960s, and the ongoing efforts to prosecute Nazi criminals in the 21st century, all built on the foundation established by cases like Weber's. The principle that legal procedure cannot excuse criminal conduct became central to Germany's process of historical reckoning. For Hans Weber's family, the vindication came too late to undo the pain of his death, but it provided a measure of closure. His wife, who had been ostracized by some in their community for being married to a man labeled a deserter, lived to see his name cleared. She attended Brenner's trial and testified about the impact of Hans's execution on her life. Her testimony was heartbreaking. She described the years of shame, the whispers and accusations, the struggle to raise their daughter alone while bearing the stigma of her husband's supposed cowardice. But she also spoke about the relief of finally knowing the truth, of being able to tell her daughter that her father had been a good man, that he had tried to do the right thing. Weber's daughter, who was only 3 when her father was executed, grew up with almost no memory of him. For years, she believed the official story, that he had been a deserter, a coward who had abandoned his duty. Learning the truth in her early 20s was both liberating and painful. She became an advocate for children of war victims, working to ensure that the stories of those wrongly executed or persecuted were preserved and honored. She often spoke about the importance of her Uncle Peter's work, how his refusal to accept injustice had given her back her father's memory. The Weber case also had implications for how we think about the relationship between law and morality. The original tribunal's decision to acquit Brenner rested on a formalist interpretation of law. Brenner had followed the rules as they existed at the time, and therefore his actions were legal. But Pieter's investigation revealed that this formalism was a facade, that Brenner had in fact violated even the rules of his own system. More fundamentally, the case challenged the idea that legality and morality can be completely separated, that something can be lawful without being just. This debate continues in legal and philosophical circles today. When should courts look beyond the letter of the law to consider its moral substance? When is it appropriate to apply contemporary standards of justice to historical actions? How do we balance the need for legal certainty with the demands of conscience? The Weber case does not provide definitive answers to these questions, but it offers a powerful example of what happens when law becomes detached from justice. It becomes a tool of oppression, a means of legitimizing violence and injustice. Pieter Van Doren's methodology also set a standard for how to investigate historical injustices. He demonstrated the importance of meticulous research, of following every lead no matter how unlikely, of being willing to spend years on a case without any guarantee of success. He showed that legal advocacy requires not just knowledge of the law, but also historical research, forensic analysis, and the ability to synthesize disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative. His work anticipated the methods used by modern human rights investigators, who often work under similar constraints: incomplete evidence, hostile authorities, and time running out. The case also illustrates the importance of building coalitions. Pieter could not have succeeded alone. He needed Kessler's testimony, Lemaire's documents, the support of sympathetic prosecutors, and eventually the backing of international legal institutions. He had to convince skeptics, overcome bureaucratic obstacles, and navigate complex political dynamics. His success depended not just on his own determination, but on his ability to persuade others that the case mattered, that justice was still possible despite the passage of time. This collaborative dimension of justice work is often overlooked. We tend to focus on individual heroes, on the lone crusader fighting against overwhelming odds. But most successful advocacy campaigns involve networks of people working together, sharing information, supporting each other through setbacks, and coordinating their efforts to overcome obstacles that no single person could surmount. Pieter's achievement was collective, even if his name is the one most often remembered. The legacy of the Weber case continues to evolve. In 2015, the International Court of Justice held a symposium commemorating the 70th anniversary of Hans Weber's execution and the 60th anniversary of Brenner's conviction. Legal scholars, human rights advocates, and students from around the world gathered to discuss the case's ongoing relevance. The consensus was that the principles established by Pieter Van Doren remain as important today as they were in the 1950s. In an era when authoritarian governments increasingly use legal mechanisms to suppress dissent and violate human rights, the Weber case serves as a reminder that the law can be both a weapon and a shield, and that vigilance is required to ensure it serves justice rather than power. Today, when students in The Hague walk past the International Court of Justice, some pause at a small plaque near the entrance. The plaque commemorates the Weber case and includes a quote from Pieter Van Doren, taken from his closing statement at Brenner's trial. It reads, "The law is not mere procedure. It is the expression of our collective commitment to justice. When procedure becomes a mask for murder, we have a duty to tear away that mask and reveal the truth. This is not vengeance. It is accountability. And without accountability, there can be no law, only power." These words continue to inspire those who work in the field of international justice. reminding them that the fight for accountability is never truly finished, that each generation must renew the commitment to hold perpetrators responsible for their crimes. The Weber case stands as a testament to the power of individual action, the importance of preserving historical memory, and the possibility of achieving justice even when the odds seem insurmountable. It is a story of tragedy and redemption, of loss and vindication, of one man's refusal to accept that murder could ever be legal, no matter what the paperwork said.